The blizzard struck Dakota Territory with the fury of a wronged woman, driving snow sideways across the prairie with such violence that even the hardy cottonwoods along Willow Creek bent nearly double under its assault. Sarah McKenzie pressed her face against the frosted window of her small cabin, watching the white curtain descend over her modest homestead like a burial shroud. At 23, she had already buried one husband and lost 2 babies to the harsh frontier, yet something in her spirit refused to yield to despair. Perhaps it was the stubborn Irish blood inherited from her grandmother, or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that surrender meant certain death in this unforgiving land. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin with a sound like lost souls seeking shelter, and Sarah pulled her worn woolen shawl more tightly around her shoulders. The fire in the stone hearth crackled bravely, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls that Thomas had built with such hope 3 years ago. Everything in the single room spoke of dreams deferred and love cut short. The marriage quilt still folded at the foot of the narrow bed, the unused cradle gathering dust in the corner, the carefully tended herb garden now buried beneath 2 feet of snow. She had been alone for 8 months now, ever since consumption claimed Thomas during the cruel spring of 1873. The other homesteaders had expected her to return east to her family in Ohio, but Sarah possessed a fierce independence that made such retreat unthinkable. This land had taken everything from her, yet she could not abandon the soil that held Thomas's bones or the dreams they had shared of building something lasting in this wild territory. The sound that interrupted her melancholy reverie was so faint she almost dismissed it as another trick of the wind. But there it came again, a rhythmic thumping against her door, weak but unmistakably human. Sarah's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. Visitors were rare enough in good weather, but in a storm like this, only desperation would drive someone to her remote homestead. She lifted the heavy wooden bar from across the door and pulled it open, immediately gasping as the wind drove snow into her face with stinging force. Through the swirling white chaos, she could barely make out the dark shape of a man collapsed against her doorframe, his clothing crusted with ice and his face pale as death itself. Without hesitation, she grasped his shoulders and dragged him across the threshold, her slight frame straining against his considerable weight. The stranger was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Ice had formed in his dark hair and beard, and his lips held the blue tinge that Sarah recognized as the harbinger of death by freezing. She barred the door against the storm and immediately set about the urgent business of preserving life. Years of frontier hardship had taught her to act swiftly in crisis, and she moved with practiced efficiency born of necessity. First, she removed his frozen outer garments, noting with some surprise the fine quality of the wool coat and the expensive leather of his boots. This was no common drifter or desperate homesteader, but a man of evident prosperity. His white shirt was of the finest cotton, and his hands, though work-roughened, bore the calluses of a man who owned cattle rather than one who merely tended them for others. Sarah wrapped him in her warmest quilts and positioned him near the fire, then set water to boil for the medicinal tea her grandmother had taught her to prepare. As she worked, she found herself stealing glances at his face, now relaxed in unconsciousness. He possessed the strong features of a man accustomed to command, with high cheekbones and a determined jaw softened somewhat by the vulnerability of his present condition. There was something compelling about his countenance, a suggestion of both strength and hidden sorrow that stirred unexpected feelings in her carefully guarded heart. As the warmth of the cabin began to work its healing magic, the stranger stirred and attempted to speak. Sarah knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his forehead to check for fever. His eyes opened slowly, revealing depths of the most extraordinary blue-green, like the surface of a mountain lake in summer. For a moment, they simply gazed at each other, and Sarah felt a curious flutter in her chest that she had not experienced since her courtship with Thomas. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse but cultured, carrying the slight accent of education and breeding that marked him as distinctly different from the rough frontiersmen who typically passed through this territory. "You're safe," Sarah replied softly, offering him a cup of the steaming herbal tea. "My cabin, about 15 miles south of Deadwood. The storm caught you badly, I'm afraid. You were near frozen when you reached my door." He attempted to sit up, then thought better of it as weakness overcame him. "I must thank you, madam. I fear I would have perished without your kindness. I am He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. I am James Mays. Sarah noted the slight hesitation and wondered what name he had been about to give instead. Sarah McKenzie, she replied simply. Mrs. McKenzie, though I am recently widowed. You need not concern yourself with proprieties under such circumstances, Mr. Mays. Christian charity knows no boundaries when life hangs in the balance. Something flickered in James Mays's remarkable eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of some kind. You live here alone, Mrs. McKenzie? This is remarkably isolated country for a woman without protection. There was no judgment in his tone, merely curiosity touched with what might have been admiration. Sarah felt herself warming under his regard in a way that had nothing to do with the fire blazing in the hearth. I have my rifle and my wits, Mr. Mays, and I have learned that a woman may accomplish much when necessity demands it. This land may be hard, but it does not discriminate between male and female when it comes to rewarding honest labor. Indeed, he murmured, and she caught something that might have been approval in his voice. And you survived alone through the winter thus far? I have, Sarah replied with quiet pride. Though I confess this storm has tested my preparations more severely than I anticipated. I fear my woodpile may not last another week of weather such as this. James Mays's eyes grew troubled at this information, though he said nothing immediately. Instead, he allowed her to help him drink the medicinal tea, and Sarah found herself acutely aware of the intimacy of the situation. Here was a man of evident refinement and substance, yet she was tending to him with the same care she would offer any fellow creature in distress. The thought struck her that Thomas would have approved of her actions, for he had always admired her generous heart and practical nature. As the evening wore on and the storm continued its relentless assault on the cabin, Sarah prepared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread. She had been carefully rationing her supplies through the hard winter, but the presence of her unexpected guest stirred something hospitable in her nature that overrode practical concerns. Perhaps it was simply the relief of human company after months of solitude, or perhaps it was the growing awareness that James Mays was unlike any man she had encountered in her frontier experience. This is a feast, he declared, though Sarah knew the humble meal was far beneath what such a man was likely accustomed to. I cannot recall when simple food has tasted so welcome. You possess considerable skills, Mrs. McKenzie. One learns to make do with available resources, Sarah replied modestly, though she felt a warm glow at his praise. The frontier teaches economy in all things, though I confess I have indulged tonight in your honor. A traveler rescued from a storm deserves the best hospitality one can offer. As they shared the meal by firelight, James Mays proved to be an engaging conversationalist, displaying knowledge of literature and current affairs that suggested extensive education and wide experience of the world. He spoke of travels to San Francisco and Chicago, of cattle markets and railroad development, of political changes in the territorial government that might affect homesteaders like herself. Yet Sarah noticed that he offered little personal information, deflecting her gentle inquiries with such skill that she barely noticed she was learning nothing of his own circumstances. You speak of these matters with great authority, Mr. Mays, she observed at length. Are you perhaps involved in the cattle trade yourself? Again that slight hesitation, as if he were choosing his words with unusual care. I have some involvement with ranching enterprises, yes. The territory is changing rapidly as more settlers arrive and the railroad extends its reach. These are momentous times for those with the vision to recognize opportunity. And the resources to grasp it, Sarah added with a slight smile. I fear that those of us on small homesteads may find ourselves swept aside by these grand developments you describe. Something in her tone seemed to touch him, for his expression grew serious and his remarkable eyes fixed upon her with new intensity. You speak as one who has given considerable thought to these matters, Mrs. McKenzie. Many in your situation would simply hope for the best without attempting to understand the larger forces at work. Understanding is the beginning of adaptation, Sarah replied thoughtfully. My late husband and I often discussed such things during the long winter evenings. He believed that knowledge was the most valuable possession any person could acquire, regardless of their station in life. "He sounds like a man of wisdom as well as good fortune in his choice of wife," James Mays said quietly, and Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. The storm raged through the night with undiminished fury, making any thought of departure impossible. Sarah gave her guest the bed while she made do with quilts before the fire, though she slept fitfully, acutely aware of his presence in her small domain. Several times she woke to find him watching her with an expression she could not interpret, and each time their eyes met across the dim cabin, she felt that curious flutter in her chest grow stronger. Morning brought no relief from the blizzard. If anything, the wind had increased in violence, and the snow was falling even more heavily. Sarah woke to find James Mays already awake, and studying her modest surroundings with what appeared to be careful attention to detail. When he noticed her stirring, he quickly averted his gaze, but not before she caught something that looked almost like calculation in his expression. "I fear I must impose upon your hospitality another day, Mrs. McKenzie," he said with what seemed like genuine regret. "The storm shows no signs of abating, and travel would be suicide in such conditions." "You are welcome to remain as long as necessary," Sarah assured him, though privately she wondered how her limited supplies would stretch to accommodate an extended visit. "Though I confess I am not equipped for lengthy entertaining. My resources are somewhat strained after the long winter." She had not meant to reveal her precarious circumstances so directly, but something in his manner encouraged honesty. James Mays's expression grew thoughtful at her admission, and she had the distinct impression that he was filing away this information for some future purpose. "Perhaps I might contribute to the household in some way," he suggested. "I am not entirely helpless, despite my dramatic arrival at your doorstep. Surely there is some task I might undertake to earn my keep." The offer both surprised and pleased Sarah, for few men of obvious breeding would consider manual labor appropriate to their station. "The wood supply could use attention," she admitted. "There is an axe in the lean-to behind the cabin, though I fear the work will be difficult in these conditions." "Difficult work builds character," he replied with a smile that transformed his austere features into something remarkably appealing. "And I find myself in need of physical activity after so much enforced rest." Sarah watched through the window as he battled the storm to reach her modest woodpile, noting the easy competence with which he wielded the axe despite the howling wind and driving snow. This was clearly a man accustomed to physical labor, whatever his evident prosperity might suggest about his current circumstances. The way he moved spoke of strength carefully controlled and power held in reserve, and Sarah found herself admiring more than merely his willingness to work. When he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice from his hair, Sarah had prepared hot coffee and fresh biscuits. The domestic scene felt strangely natural, as if they had shared such mornings for years rather than having met less than 24 hours ago. There was something about James Mays that invited trust and companionship, despite the obvious mysteries surrounding his identity and circumstances. "You handle an axe with considerable skill, Mr. Mays," Sarah observed as she served him the steaming coffee. "That suggests experience with such work." "A man learns many skills in this country, Mrs. McKenzie, regardless of his origins or expectations," he replied carefully. "The frontier has a way of reducing all pretensions to their essential elements." "Indeed it does," Sarah agreed, thinking of her own transformation from the sheltered daughter of an Ohio merchant to a self-reliant frontier widow. "Though I sometimes wonder if we lose as much as we gain in the process of such adaptation." James Mays studied her with renewed interest. "What do you believe we lose?" Sarah considered the question seriously, for it touched upon thoughts that had occupied her during many lonely hours. "Perhaps a certain gentleness of spirit," she said at length. "The leisure to contemplate beauty for its own sake rather than always calculating practical value. The luxury of trust that comes from living in civilized society among people bound by common understanding." "And yet," he said softly, "you opened your door to a freezing stranger without hesitation. That suggests a generosity of spirit that civilization often discourages rather than nurtures." Their eyes met across the rough wooden table, and Sarah felt something shift in the atmosphere between them, a recognition of kinship that transcended their brief acquaintance. Here was a man who understood the complexities of frontier existence, who could appreciate both its hardships and its strange freedoms. The realization stirred feelings in her heart that she had believed buried with Thomas, and the intensity of her response both thrilled and frightened her. As the day wore on, they fell into an easy rhythm of conversation and shared tasks that felt remarkably natural for two people who remained virtual strangers. James Mays proved to be well-read and thoughtful, able to discuss everything from literature to politics to the practical challenges of homesteading with equal facility. Yet Sarah noticed that he continued to deflect personal questions with subtle skill, maintaining an air of mystery that only increased her curiosity about his true circumstances. The storm finally began to show signs of weakening by late afternoon, though the snow continued to fall steadily. Sarah found herself hoping it would continue through another night, for she was reluctant to see her interesting guest depart so soon. The loneliness of her isolated existence had never seemed so pronounced as it did now, in contrast to the warmth of human companionship. "I fear I must attempt to continue my journey tomorrow if the weather permits," James Mays said as they shared another simple evening meal. "I have business in Deadwood that cannot be delayed indefinitely." "Of course," Sarah replied, though she could not entirely hide her disappointment. "Though I hope you will be careful. The trails will be treacherous for days after such a storm." Something in her tone seemed to affect him, for his expression grew suddenly intense. "Mrs. McKenzie, I wonder if I might speak frankly about a matter that concerns me greatly." "Certainly," Sarah replied, puzzled by his serious tone. "Your situation here troubles me more than I can express. A woman alone in such isolation, with winter supplies running low and no neighbors within calling distance, it is a recipe for disaster. Have you considered that you might be taking unnecessary risks with your safety and well-being?" Sarah stiffened slightly at what seemed like criticism of her choices. "I am aware of the risks, Mr. Mays, but I am equally aware of my capabilities. I have survived 8 months alone and intend to survive whatever challenges remain." "I do not question your capabilities," he said quickly, "but surely even the most capable person must acknowledge that some challenges exceed individual resources. What if you should fall ill? What if your supplies run out before spring? What if another storm such as this one damages your cabin?" "Then I will face those challenges as they arise," Sarah replied with quiet determination. "I will not abandon what Thomas and I built together simply because the future holds uncertainties." James Mays leaned forward, his remarkable eyes fixed upon her with compelling intensity. "But what if there were alternatives? What if circumstances could be arranged that would provide security without requiring you to abandon your independence or your connection to this place?" Sarah studied his face, sensing that his words carried meaning beyond their surface content. "What sort of alternatives do you envision, Mr. Mays?" For a moment, he seemed on the verge of speaking candidly, but then that familiar caution returned to his expression. "I merely suggest that a woman of your obvious capabilities need not limit herself to the most difficult options available. There are those in the territory who would consider it an honor to offer protection and partnership to someone of your character." The implications of his words sent a flutter through Sarah's chest, though she was not entirely certain she understood his meaning correctly. "Protection and partnership," she repeated thoughtfully. "Those are significant words, Mr. Mays." "Indeed they are," he replied seriously. "And I do not use them lightly, I assure you." They regarded each other in silence for a long moment, the firelight playing across their faces and casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Sarah felt as if they were engaged in some complex negotiation whose terms she did not fully understand, yet the undercurrent of attraction between them was impossible to deny. Whatever secrets James Mays might harbor, she found herself drawn to him in ways that both excited and alarmed her practical nature. The evening passed with a tension that had not been present before, as if something significant hung in the balance between them. When Sarah finally retired to her makeshift bed before the fire, she lay awake listening to the gradually diminishing storm and wondering what the morning would bring. James Mays's words echoed in her mind, laden with possibilities that she hardly dared consider. protection and partnership. What could he mean by such terms, and why did the prospect both thrill and terrify her in equal measure? She had married Thomas for love, but their union had also been born of practical necessity and shared dreams of building something lasting in this harsh land. Now, with Thomas gone and her resources dwindling, perhaps it was time to consider whether love might bloom again under different circumstances. The thought felt like both betrayal and liberation, and Sarah found herself torn between loyalty to the past and hope for an uncertain future. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last conscious thought was a prayer that whatever the morning brought, she would have the wisdom to choose well and the courage to face the consequences of her decision. The storm might be ending, but she sensed that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine, all because she had shown kindness to a freezing stranger who might prove to be far more than he seemed. Dawn broke clear and bitter cold over the snow-blanketed prairie, the storm having finally exhausted its fury during the night. Sarah woke to find brilliant sunlight streaming through her frost-covered windows, transforming her humble cabin into a crystalline palace of reflected light. The silence that followed the wind's constant howling felt almost oppressive in its completeness, broken only by the gentle crackling of the dying fire and the soft breathing of her sleeping guest. James Mays looked younger in sleep, the lines of authority and hidden concern smoothed from his features. Sarah found herself studying his face more openly than propriety would normally allow, noting the way the morning light revealed silver threads in his dark hair and the small scar that marked his left temple. This was a man who had lived fully and faced danger, yet something in his expression, even in unconsciousness, suggested burdens that went beyond physical hardship. The sound of her moving about the cabin woke him, and those remarkable blue-green eyes opened to find her preparing breakfast at the small cook-stove. For a moment, neither spoke, both aware that this might be their final morning together and reluctant to break the spell of intimacy that had developed between them. "The storm has passed," Sarah said finally, her voice carefully neutral despite the tumult of emotions beneath her composed exterior. "So it has," James Mays replied, sitting up and running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I suppose I must prepare to continue my journey to Deadwood, though I confess I am reluctant to leave such comfortable surroundings." Sarah felt her heart skip at his words, though she maintained her outward composure. "You are welcome to break your fast before departing. The least I can offer is a warm meal to sustain you on your travels." As she served him coffee and the last of her carefully hoarded bacon, Sarah noticed that he seemed preoccupied, as if wrestling with some internal decision. Several times he appeared on the verge of speaking, only to fall silent and return to his thoughtful contemplation. The tension between them had only increased with the approaching moment of departure, and Sarah found herself wishing desperately for the courage to voice the feelings that had been growing in her heart. "Mrs. McKenzie," he said at length, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care, "I find myself in the unusual position of wishing to speak candidly while being constrained by circumstances I cannot fully explain." Sarah's pulse quickened at his serious tone. "I would welcome candor, Mr. Mays, though I understand that we all have private matters we prefer to keep to ourselves." "Indeed," he murmured, rising from the table to pace the small confines of the cabin like a caged wolf. "Yet sometimes circumstances arise that make such privacy a luxury we can ill afford." He turned to face her directly, and Sarah was struck by the intensity of his expression. Here was a man accustomed to command, struggling with a decision that clearly carried significant weight. The sight of such obvious internal conflict in one so evidently strong stirred protective instincts in Sarah that surprised her with their strength. "What I am about to tell you may sound presumptuous beyond all bounds," James Mays continued, his voice careful and measured. "Yet I find I cannot in good conscience depart without making you aware of certain possibilities that might materially improve your circumstances." Sarah's heart began to beat faster, though she strove to maintain her composure. "I am listening, Mr. Mays. There are men of substance in this territory who would consider themselves honored to offer marriage to a woman of your obvious virtues," he said, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Men who could provide security, comfort, and protection without requiring you to abandon your independence of spirit or your connection to this land you clearly love." The word marriage hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Sarah felt her cheeks warm with a mixture of embarrassment and excitement. "That is indeed a significant statement, Mr. Mays. Might I ask what prompts such an observation?" "Your situation troubles me greatly," he replied with evident sincerity. "You possess courage, intelligence, and capability that would be valued by any man of sense, yet you remain isolated here with resources that cannot sustain you indefinitely. It seems a tragic waste of exceptional qualities." Sarah studied his face, searching for clues to his true meaning. "And do you speak theoretically, Mr. Mays, or do you have specific arrangements in mind?" For a moment, something flickered in his eyes that might have been hope or fear, quickly suppressed. "There is a man of my acquaintance who has spoken often of his desire to find a wife worthy of partnership rather than merely ornamental companionship. He possesses extensive holdings in cattle and land, political influence, and the resources to ensure that any woman who accepted his proposal would want for nothing." Sarah's heart sank slightly at this revelation, though she was not entirely certain why. Perhaps she had been hoping for something more personal in his proposal, though logic suggested that such hopes were foolish given their brief acquaintance. "This acquaintance of yours sounds like a most eligible gentleman. And you believe he might be interested in someone of my circumstances?" "I believe he would consider himself the most fortunate of men to secure such a wife," James Mays replied with quiet conviction. "Though I should warn you that he is not a young man, nor one given to romantic gestures. He would offer respect, security, and genuine partnership, but perhaps not the passionate love that a woman of your youth and beauty might naturally desire." The qualifications stung more than Sarah cared to admit, though she recognized the practical wisdom in his words. Romantic love was a luxury that few frontier women could afford, and she had been fortunate to experience it once with Thomas. Perhaps it was greedy to hope for such happiness twice in one lifetime. "This gentleman," she said carefully, "what manner of man is he in character and temperament?" "Honorable in all his dealings, respected throughout the territory, and known for his fair treatment of those in his employ," James Mays replied promptly. "He is stern when circumstances require it, but just in his judgments and generous with those who earn his trust. He has built his holdings through hard work and careful planning rather than through exploitation or questionable means." "And his age?" Sarah found herself asking, though she immediately regretted the question as too personal. "He has seen 45 years, came the careful reply. "Old enough to be settled in his ways and secure in his position, but not so advanced in age as to be unable to appreciate a young wife or to father children should such blessing be granted." Children. The word struck Sarah with unexpected force, reminding her of the cradle that still gathered dust in the corner of her cabin. She had mourned not only Thomas's death, but also the loss of the family they had planned to build together. The possibility of motherhood seemed like a distant dream now, yet here was a man speaking of it as if it might still be within her reach. "This gentleman," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady, "has he indicated any particular requirements or expectations regarding a potential wife?" "Only that she possess intelligence, moral character, and the strength to be a true partner in building something lasting," James Mays replied. "He has no patience for simpering ornaments or social butterflies who view marriage merely as an escape from responsibility. He seeks a woman who can match his strength with her own, who can contribute to rather than merely benefit from their union." Sarah felt a stirring of interest despite her reservations. Such a partnership sounded appealing after the loneliness of her current existence, and the description suggested a man who might value her capabilities rather than see them as unwomanly assertions. "And you believe I might satisfy such requirements?" "I believe any man would count himself blessed to secure such a wife," he said with quiet intensity, and something in his tone made Sarah look at him more sharply. There was more here than mere friendly concern for her welfare, she realized. The way he spoke of this mysterious gentleman's requirements, the careful precision of his words, the slight tension in his bearing, all suggested a personal investment in her response that went beyond casual acquaintance. "Mr. Mays," she said slowly, "this acquaintance of yours, might I ask his name?" The question hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. James Mays's entire bearing grew still, and Sarah had the distinct impression that they had reached some crucial juncture in their conversation. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, yet she could hear the underlying tension. "His name is James Mays," he said quietly, "and he stands before you hoping that his proposal might not be entirely unwelcome." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the meaning of his words pierced her consciousness. The mysterious gentleman of substance was no distant acquaintance but the man who had shared her cabin, her meals, her fireside conversation for the past 2 days. The stranger she had rescued from the storm was proposing marriage, and the realization sent her mind reeling with implications she had not considered. "You," she whispered, staring at him with new eyes. "You are speaking of yourself." "I am," he confirmed, his remarkable eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see into her very soul. "Though I fear I have presented the matter clumsily, and perhaps presumed too much upon our brief acquaintance." Sarah's legs felt suddenly unsteady, and she sank into the nearest chair, her mind struggling to process this unexpected revelation. The man who had chopped her wood and shared her table was not merely a traveler passing through, but someone of evident wealth and position, someone who possessed the resources to transform her life entirely. Yet even more surprising than his circumstances was the fact that he was asking her to share them. "I do not understand," she said at length. "You speak of extensive holdings and political influence, yet you were traveling alone in a blizzard with no escort or protection. How do I reconcile these contradictions?" "I own the Double Eagle Ranch," James Mays said simply, and Sarah gasped at the implication. Everyone in Dakota Territory had heard of the Double Eagle, one of the largest and most successful cattle operations in the region. Its owner was rumored to be a man of immense wealth and influence, someone who dealt with railroad barons and territorial governors as equals. "The Double Eagle," she repeated faintly. "But that would make you one of the wealthiest men in the territory." "Wealth is relative, Mrs. McKenzie, but yes, I have been blessed with considerable material success," he replied with what might have been embarrassment. "As to my traveling alone in the storm, I was returning from business in Rapid City when the weather turned unexpectedly severe. My men are no doubt searching for me even now, though the storm would have prevented any rescue attempts." Sarah stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man who had split her firewood and shared her simple meals without complaint. "Why did you not reveal your identity immediately? Surely you must have realized that I would have treated you differently had I known." "That is precisely why I did not reveal it," he said with a slight smile. "I wanted to know you as you truly are, not as you might present yourself to a man of wealth and position. Too often, people show me only what they believe I wish to see, and I have grown weary of such pretense." The honesty of his response touched something deep in Sarah's heart, yet she found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was proposing. Marriage to such a man would mean leaving her simple cabin for a mansion, trading her isolated existence for a position of prominence in territorial society. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. "Mr. Mays," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to address a man whose true position she was only beginning to comprehend. "James," he said gently, "if you are to consider my proposal, surely we might dispense with such formality." "James," she repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "This is all quite overwhelming. 2 days ago, I was a lonely widow struggling to survive the winter, and now you are proposing that I become the wife of one of the territory's most prominent citizens. Surely you can understand that I need time to consider such a momentous decision." "Of course," he replied, though she caught a flicker of disappointment in his expression. "I realize the proposal must seem sudden, even presumptuous. Yet I hope you will consider that sometimes the most important decisions in life present themselves when we least expect them." "And what of affection?" Sarah found herself asking, the question escaping before she could consider its propriety. "You speak of partnership and respect, but surely marriage should involve some measure of genuine feeling between the participants." James Mays's expression grew suddenly intense, and he moved closer to where she sat, close enough that she could catch the scent of snow and pine that clung to his clothes. "Mrs. McKenzie, Sarah, I would not have made such a proposal if I did not feel something considerable for you already. These past 2 days have shown me a woman of remarkable courage, intelligence, and grace. You opened your home to a stranger, tended to his needs without thought of reward, and conducted yourself with a dignity that would grace any drawing room in San Francisco or New York. Sarah felt her cheeks warm at his praise, yet she pressed on with her questioning. But surely you must have known many women of suitable breeding and education. Why would you choose to propose to a frontier widow you have known for mere days? Because, he said softly, reaching out to take her hands in his. In 2 days you have shown me more genuine warmth and honest companionship than I have experienced in years of acquaintance with the so-called suitable ladies of territorial society. You treated me as a man rather than as a collection of assets and opportunities. You showed me kindness without calculation and interest without agenda. Such qualities are rarer than gold in my experience. The warmth of his hands surrounding hers sent unexpected tremors through Sarah's frame, and she found herself looking up into those remarkable eyes with a feeling that might have been the beginning of love. Yet practical concerns intruded even upon such sweet possibilities. What would be expected of me as your wife? She asked, striving to maintain some semblance of rational thought despite the chaos of emotions swirling in her chest. Partnership in all things, he replied promptly. The Double Eagle is more than a ranch, it is a complex enterprise involving cattle, land development, political relationships, and business dealings throughout the territory. I need a wife who can understand such matters and contribute her own insights and capabilities to our mutual success. And socially, Sarah persisted, thinking of her simple frontier upbringing and limited education. You would be mistress of one of the finest homes in Dakota Territory and expected to entertain guests of considerable importance, he admitted. Yet I believe your natural grace and intelligence would adapt quickly to such requirements. I would, of course, provide whatever guidance and support you might need. The prospect of such dramatic change in circumstances left Sarah feeling slightly breathless. To go from her isolated cabin to presiding over grand entertainments seemed almost impossibly daunting, yet something in James Mays's confidence in her abilities stirred an answering pride in her own capabilities. And if I were to accept your proposal, she said carefully, what arrangements would you envision for our wedding and the establishment of our household? We could be married immediately by the circuit judge in Deadwood, he replied. Or if you prefer, arrangements could be made for a more elaborate ceremony befitting your new position. As to household arrangements, you would be mistress of the main ranch house, with a full staff to assist in managing the domestic responsibilities. Sarah's head swam at the thought of managing servants and grand entertainments when she had grown accustomed to doing everything for herself. Yet the prospect of sharing such responsibilities with a man who clearly valued her contributions held considerable appeal after months of solitary struggle. This is all quite beyond anything I had imagined possible, she admitted honestly. Yet I confess myself intrigued by the partnership you describe. Too often, marriage seems to require women to diminish themselves rather than grow into greater possibilities. With you as my wife, I believe we could accomplish far more together than either of us might achieve alone, James said with quiet conviction. The territory is changing rapidly, and those who can adapt and grow with it will prosper. I need a partner who can match my vision with her own intelligence and determination. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their intimate conversation, and James Mays's expression grew suddenly alert. Through the window, Sarah could see a group of riders approaching across the snow-covered prairie, their horses laboring through the drifts with the determined persistence of men on urgent business. My search party, James explained, moving to the window to confirm his assessment. They have found me at last, though I confess I am not entirely pleased by their timing. Sarah felt a pang of loss at the realization that their private interlude was about to end, to be replaced by the intrusion of the outside world with all its complications and expectations. Whatever decision she made regarding James Mays's proposal would have to be made quickly now, before he was swept back into his normal life of wealth and responsibility. What must I tell them about my presence here? She asked, suddenly aware of the potential scandal of an unmarried woman entertaining a gentleman alone in her cabin for 2 nights. Nothing but the truth, James replied firmly. That you saved my life through your kindness and generosity, and that any man who questions your conduct will answer to me personally. The protective tone in his voice sent a warm flutter through Sarah's chest, suggesting that his proposal involved more than mere practical convenience. Here was a man prepared to defend her reputation and honor, qualities that spoke well of his character regardless of his wealth. The riders drew up before the cabin in a flurry of snorting horses and jangling harness, and Sarah heard the distinctive voice of authority calling out commands. James Mays straightened his shoulders and assumed an air of command that transformed him yet again before her eyes, reminding her forcefully of the vast gulf between their respective positions in territorial society. "Mr. Mays," came a voice from outside. "Thank God we've found you, sir. The whole territory's been searching since the storm hit." "I am quite well, Patterson," James called back through the door. "Though I owe my life to the kindness of Mrs. McKenzie, who provided shelter when I would otherwise have perished in the blizzard." Sarah watched through the window as the men dismounted and began making preparations that suggested they expected their employer to depart immediately. The sight filled her with a curious mixture of loss and panic, for she realized that once James Mays left her cabin, he would return to a world where their brief intimacy might seem like nothing more than a pleasant interlude. "Sarah," he said quietly, turning back to her with an expression of urgent intensity. "I know this is sudden and perhaps overwhelming, but I need your answer before I depart. Will you consider my proposal of marriage?" The directness of his question left no room for evasion, and Sarah found herself looking into those remarkable blue-green eyes with a heart full of conflicting emotions. Logic suggested that accepting such a proposal would solve all her practical problems while offering opportunities beyond her wildest dreams. Yet something deeper than logic was involved in such a decision, something that had to do with the stirring of feelings she had thought buried with Thomas. "I need time to consider such a momentous decision," she said finally, though part of her wanted to accept immediately and throw caution to the wind. "Of course," James replied, though she could see the disappointment in his expression. "But how much time? I must return to the ranch, and there are business matters that cannot be delayed indefinitely." "A week," Sarah said impulsively. "Give me 1 week to consider your proposal thoroughly, and I will send you my answer." "A week," he agreed, though something in his tone suggested he found the delay almost unbearable. "But Sarah, you must understand that if you accept, there can be no lengthy courtship or gradual acquaintance. The territory is too small and gossip too prevalent for us to conduct an extended romance without damaging your reputation irreparably." The implication was clear. Acceptance would mean immediate marriage, with all the dramatic changes such a union would entail. Sarah felt her pulse quicken at the thought, yet she forced herself to maintain outward composure. "I understand," she replied quietly. "If I accept your proposal, I will be prepared to marry immediately upon your return." Something flared in James Mays's eyes at her words, an intensity that spoke of desire as well as practical convenience. For a moment, Sarah thought he might take her in his arms despite the presence of his men outside, and she found herself hoping that he would. The realization of her own longing came as something of a shock, for she had not expected to feel such attraction to any man after Thomas. "1 week then," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand once more. "But Sarah, please consider not just the practical advantages of such a union, but also the possibility that genuine affection might grow between us. I would not want you to think this proposal is based solely on convenience or business considerations. And I would not want you to think that I am motivated only by the security and position such a marriage would provide," Sarah replied with matching honesty. "If I accept your proposal, it will be because I believe we might find happiness together as well as partnership." The conversation was interrupted by a respectful knock at the door, and James Mays reluctantly released her hand to admit his foreman. The man who entered was clearly accustomed to dealing with matters of importance, yet he showed obvious deference to his employer while maintaining a carefully neutral expression regarding Sarah's presence. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Mays, but we've been worried sick since the storm hit," the foreman said with evident relief. "The boys have been searching in shifts, and Mrs. Harrison has been beside herself with concern." Sarah caught the reference to Mrs. Harrison, and wondered who this woman might be who felt entitled to such concern for James Mays's welfare. A housekeeper, perhaps, or some other member of his household staff who had grown protective of her employer's well-being. "Please convey my apologies to Mrs. Harrison for causing such worry," James replied smoothly. "I was fortunate to find shelter with Mrs. McKenzie here, who showed me extraordinary kindness during the storm." The foreman's eyes flicked briefly to Sarah, and she caught something that might have been speculation in his expression before he resumed his professional demeanor. "Yes, sir. Shall I have the boys prepare for immediate departure? The weather's clear now, and we could make good time back to the ranch." "Yes, make the necessary preparations," James confirmed, though his eyes remained fixed on Sarah's face. "I'll be ready to depart shortly." As the foreman withdrew to organize the departure, James Mays turned back to Sarah with an expression of obvious reluctance. "I must go now, but I want you to know that this week will seem like the longest of my life. Please, Sarah, consider not just the practical aspects of my proposal, but also the possibility that we might find real happiness together." "I will consider everything," Sarah promised, though her heart was already beginning to whisper what her answer would be. "And James, thank you for trusting me enough to reveal your true identity and intentions. That honesty means more to me than you might realize." "Thank you for showing me what genuine kindness looks like," he replied softly. "Whatever your decision, I will always be grateful for these 2 days of peace and honest companionship." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, both aware that this parting might change everything between them. When James Mays finally took his leave, bending formally over her hand in a gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect and intimate promise, Sarah felt as if a vital part of herself was departing with him. She watched from her window as the party of riders disappeared across the snow-covered prairie, James Mays's tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. Only when they had vanished entirely did she allow herself to sink into the nearest chair and contemplate the extraordinary turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a struggling widow facing an uncertain future with dwindling resources and no prospects beyond mere survival. Now she faced the possibility of marriage to one of the territory's most prominent citizens, a union that would transform her from an isolated homesteader into a woman of wealth and influence. Yet, even more significant than the material advantages was the growing realization that James Mays had stirred feelings in her heart that she had thought permanently buried. The question that tormented her as she sat alone in her cabin was whether accepting his proposal would constitute a betrayal of Thomas's memory or a natural progression toward a different kind of happiness. Logic argued that the dead had no claim upon the living, that Thomas would have wanted her to find security and companionship rather than waste away in lonely dedication to his memory. Yet her heart struggled with the implications of opening itself to love again, particularly love that came wrapped in such dramatic changes of circumstance. As evening approached and Sarah prepared her solitary meal, she found herself analyzing every moment of James Mays's visit, searching for clues to his true character beneath the surface charm and obvious attraction. His willingness to work despite his wealth, his respectful treatment of her despite her humble circumstances, his honest admission of loneliness despite his apparent success, all suggested a man worthy of trust and affection. Yet questions remained that only time and experience could answer. Would he continue to value her opinions and capabilities once they were married, or would he expect her to become a decorative ornament suitable to his position? Could genuine love develop between them, or would their union remain a partnership of convenience despite their obvious attraction? And perhaps most importantly, did she possess the strength and adaptability to transform herself from a frontier widow into the wife of a cattle baron without losing her essential self in the process? The week ahead would be the longest of her life, Sarah realized, filled with the most important decision she had ever faced. Whatever choice she made would determine not just her material future but the very direction of her heart and soul. As she banked the fire for the night and prepared to sleep alone once more, Sarah whispered a prayer for wisdom and courage, knowing that when James Mays returned, she would need both in abundance to face whatever future awaited them. The week that followed James Mays's departure proved to be the longest and most tumultuous of Sarah's life. Each day brought fresh considerations and internal debates that left her alternately elated and terrified at the prospect of accepting his proposal. She found herself analyzing every word of their conversations, every glance and gesture, searching for evidence of his true feelings and intentions while wrestling with her own rapidly evolving emotions. On the third day, an unexpected visitor arrived at her cabin in the form of Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, the woman whose concern for James Mays had been mentioned by his foreman. Sarah's heart sank as she observed the elegant carriage approaching across the prairie, drawn by matched bay horses and attended by a liveried driver. Here, clearly, was a representative of the world James Mays inhabited, and Sarah felt her confidence waver as she contemplated the vast gulf between her humble circumstances and such obvious refinement. Mrs. Harrison proved to be a handsome woman of perhaps 40 years, impeccably dressed in the latest fashion and possessed of the unmistakable bearing of one accustomed to social prominence. Her manner was courteous but distant as she accepted Sarah's invitation to enter the cabin, and her keen gray eyes took careful inventory of the modest surroundings with what might have been disapproval. "Mrs. McKenzie," she began without preamble, settling herself carefully on the edge of Sarah's best chair as if afraid of contamination. "I understand that you recently provided shelter to Mr. James Mays during the blizzard." "I did," Sarah replied simply, offering her guest tea with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. "He arrived half-frozen at my door, and Christian charity demanded that I offer assistance." "Indeed," Mrs. Harrison murmured, accepting the cup with a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. How fortunate for Mr. Mays that he found such accommodating shelter in his time of need. The subtle emphasis on the word accommodating made Sarah's cheeks burn with indignation, though she strove to maintain her dignity in the face of such obvious insinuation. "I trust there is nothing improper suggested by my actions, Mrs. Harrison. I would offer the same assistance to any fellow creature in distress, regardless of their station in life." "Oh, my dear, I meant no criticism of your charitable impulses," Mrs. Harrison replied with false sweetness, "though I confess myself somewhat surprised that a woman of your circumstances would feel qualified to entertain a gentleman of Mr. Mays's prominence." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her Irish temper begin to rise despite her determination to remain ladylike. "I fear I do not understand your meaning, Mrs. Harrison. Are you suggesting that basic human kindness requires special qualifications?" "Not at all," came the smooth reply. "Though I suspect you may not fully appreciate the complications that can arise when persons of vastly different social positions become involved with one another." Sarah set down her own teacup with careful precision, meeting Mrs. Harrison's calculating gaze with steady eyes. "Again, I must confess myself puzzled by your implications. Mr. Mays and I shared nothing more than civilized conversation and mutual courtesy during his brief stay." "I am certain that is true," Mrs. Harrison said with a patronizing smile. "Yet I feel it my duty as Mr. Mays's friend to warn you that certain expectations may arise from such intimate circumstances, expectations that could lead to considerable disappointment for all parties involved." The word friend was delivered with particular emphasis, and Sarah began to understand the true purpose of this unexpected visit. Mrs. Harrison clearly considered herself to have some claim upon James Mays's affections, and she had come to warn off potential competition from what she obviously regarded as an unsuitable quarter. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah replied with icy politeness, "though I confess I fail to see how my brief acquaintance with Mr. Mays could possibly affect your own friendship with him." Mrs. Harrison's composed facade cracked slightly at this direct challenge, revealing a flash of something that might have been jealousy or rage before she regained her self-control. "My dear Mrs. McKenzie, I fear you misunderstand the situation entirely. Mr. Mays and I have an understanding of long standing, one that has been acknowledged by all of territorial society. We have simply delayed formal announcement pending certain business arrangements." The word struck Sarah like a physical blow, though she struggled to maintain her outward composure. Here was information that cast James Mays's proposal in an entirely different light, suggesting that his protestations of loneliness and desire for partnership might be nothing more than the calculated deceptions of a man seeking diversion outside his proper social sphere. "I see," Sarah managed, her voice carefully controlled despite the chaos of emotions beneath. And you felt it necessary to inform me of this understanding because I would hate to see an innocent woman of limited experience develop unrealistic expectations regarding a man whose affections are already engaged elsewhere, Mrs. Harrison replied with false solicitude. Mr. Mays has always been kind to those beneath his station, but kindness should not be mistaken for romantic interest. The phrase beneath his station burned in Sarah's consciousness like a brand, yet she forced herself to respond with dignity. I thank you for your concern, Mrs. Harrison, though I assure you it is quite unnecessary. I have developed no expectations whatsoever regarding Mr. Mays beyond gratitude for his courteous behavior during his stay. How sensible of you, Mrs. Harrison murmured, rising from her chair with obvious satisfaction at having delivered her message. I was certain that a woman of your practical nature would understand the realities of the situation. Mr. Mays speaks very highly of your domestic capabilities. The condescending praise felt like salt in an open wound, yet Sarah maintained her composure as she escorted her unwelcome guest to the door. Only after the elegant carriage had disappeared across the prairie did she allow herself to sink into a chair and confront the devastating implications of what she had learned. If Mrs. Harrison spoke the truth, then James Mays's proposal was nothing more than a cruel deception, the whim of a wealthy man amusing himself with the pretense of serious courtship. The partnership he had described so eloquently, the respect and affection he had professed to feel, the promise of genuine love developing between them, all of it might be nothing more than elaborate lies designed to secure a temporary arrangement that would end the moment his true obligations called him back to his proper sphere. Yet even as these bitter thoughts consumed her, Sarah found herself questioning Mrs. Harrison's motives and credibility. There had been something desperate in the woman's manner, a suggestion that her claims of understanding with James Mays might be more wishful thinking than established fact. The very urgency of her visit suggested someone fighting to protect interests that might be less secure than she pretended. As the days passed, Sarah found herself torn between the devastating doubts planted by Mrs. Harrison's visit and her own instinctive trust in the man she had come to care for so deeply. The James Mays who had chopped her wood and shared her simple meals, who had spoken with such evident sincerity about partnership and mutual respect, seemed incapable of the calculated deception that Mrs. Harrison's claims would require. On the 6th day, another visitor arrived in the form of a young man who introduced himself as Timothy Patterson, James Mays's foreman. Unlike Mrs. Harrison, he approached Sarah's cabin with obvious respect, removing his hat and addressing her with the courtesy due a lady rather than the condescension of a social superior dealing with an inferior. Mrs. McKenzie, he began, his honest face showing signs of considerable distress. I hope you'll forgive the liberty of my visit, but I felt you should know about certain developments at the ranch that might affect your understanding of recent events. Sarah's heart clenched with dread, fearing that Patterson had come to confirm Mrs. Harrison's claims about James Mays's engagement. What developments, Mr. Patterson? It concerns Mrs. Harrison, ma'am, Patterson said carefully. She's been telling everyone in the territory that she and Mr. Mays are engaged to be married, that an announcement is expected momentarily. But the thing is, ma'am, Mr. Mays himself has said nothing of the sort. In fact, he's been acting like a man with something entirely different on his mind since returning from his stay here. Relief flooded through Sarah at this revelation, though she strove to maintain appropriate dignity. I appreciate your sharing this information, Mr. Patterson, though I confess I do not entirely understand why you felt it necessary to do so. Patterson shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with the propriety of discussing his employer's private affairs. The truth is, ma'am, I've never seen Mr. Mays the way he's been this past week. He's been distracted, restless, checking the calendar constantly as if counting days. And yesterday, when Mrs. Harrison came calling and started carrying on about wedding plans and such, he told her straight out that she was mistaken about their relationship, that he had never made any promises or commitments to her. Sarah's pulse quickened at this information, though she attempted to maintain outward composure. And how did Mrs. Harrison respond to this clarification? She took it poorly, ma'am. Very poorly indeed. Started talking about how she'd ruin any woman who tried to steal him away from her, how she'd make sure certain people knew their proper place in territorial society. Patterson's expression grew troubled. "I thought you should know, in case she'd already been to see you with her stories." "She has," Sarah confirmed quietly. "And I confess her visit left me with considerable doubts about certain matters." "I hope you won't let her poison your mind against Mr. Mays, ma'am," Patterson said earnestly. "He's a good man, honest in all his dealings, and I've never known him to make promises he didn't intend to keep. Whatever he's said to you, you can trust it to be the truth." The foreman's obvious sincerity and concern for his employer's welfare went far toward restoring Sarah's faith in James Mays's character. Here was a man who had worked closely with James for years, who would surely know if his employer were capable of the kind of calculated deception that Mrs. Harrison's claims would require. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Patterson," Sarah replied with genuine gratitude. "Your words have provided considerable comfort regarding certain concerns I had developed." "I hope so, ma'am. Mr. Mays's been like a man carrying the weight of the world this past week, and I hate to see him suffer needlessly over misunderstandings that could be cleared up with a bit of plain speaking." After Patterson's departure, Sarah felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The doubts and fears that had tormented her since Mrs. Harrison's visit began to dissipate, replaced by a growing certainty about what her answer to James Mays's proposal would be. Yet even as her heart lightened, she realized that accepting his offer would mean facing considerable opposition from those who, like Mrs. Harrison, considered her unworthy of such an elevation in status. The seventh day dawned clear and cold, with a kind of brilliant prairie sunlight that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of crystalline beauty. Sarah woke with a sense of anticipation and nervous excitement, knowing that James Mays would return today for her answer. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, not just mentally and emotionally, but practically as well, gathering her few precious possessions and making arrangements for the cabin that had been her home for so long. The sound of approaching riders reached her ears shortly after noon, and Sarah's heart began to race as she recognized the familiar group led by James Mays himself. Through her window, she could see him sitting tall in the saddle, his dark hair gleaming in the sunlight and his expression grave with the weight of anticipation. The sight of him sent a flutter of warmth through her chest, confirming that her feelings had grown far beyond mere gratitude for his kindness. He dismounted with characteristic grace and approached her door alone, leaving his men to wait respectfully at a distance. When Sarah opened the door to admit him, she was struck anew by the compelling presence he radiated, the combination of strength and gentleness that had first attracted her during their enforced intimacy of the storm. "Sarah," he said simply, removing his hat and studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he were searching her very soul. "I have come for your answer, though I confess the waiting has nearly driven me to distraction." "Then I shall not keep you in suspense any longer," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice despite the magnitude of the moment. "I have made my decision, though I must first address certain concerns that have arisen during your absence." James Mays's expression grew immediately alert, and she caught something that might have been fear in his remarkable eyes. "What concerns? Has someone attempted to influence your decision?" "Mrs. Harrison paid me a visit," Sarah said simply, watching carefully for his reaction. "She was quite insistent that you and she have an understanding of long standing, one that would make any other romantic attachment impossible." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. James Mays's face darkened with what appeared to be genuine anger, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That woman," he muttered with obvious disgust. "I might have expected such interference from her." "Then her claims are false?" Sarah asked, though Patterson's visit had already provided considerable reassurance on this point. "Completely and utterly false," James replied with vehement sincerity. "Eleanor Harrison has harbored romantic delusions regarding our relationship for years, despite my repeated attempts to make clear that I regard her as nothing more than a social acquaintance. She has never been anything more than that, nor will she ever be." The relief that flooded through Sarah at his words was almost overwhelming, yet she pressed on with her questioning. "She seemed quite certain of her claims, James. She spoke of an understanding acknowledged by territorial society." The only understanding that exists is in Eleanor Harrison's imagination, James said grimly. She has certainly attempted to create the impression of special intimacy between us, but I have never encouraged such presumptions. In fact, I made it quite clear to her just yesterday that her assumptions were entirely mistaken. Your foreman mentioned as much when he visited me, Sarah admitted. Mr. Patterson seemed quite concerned that Mrs. Harrison's claims might influence my decision regarding your proposal. Patterson came to see you? James asked with surprise. I had no idea he had taken such initiative on my behalf. He appeared genuinely concerned for your welfare, Sarah replied. He spoke very highly of your character and honesty, which helped reassure me regarding certain doubts that Mrs. Harrison's visit had planted. James Mays's expression softened at this information, and he reached out to take her hands in his familiar gesture of intimacy. And have those doubts been sufficiently addressed? Can you trust that my proposal was made in complete sincerity, without any conflicting obligations or commitments? I can, Sarah replied simply, looking up into his eyes with complete conviction. Which brings me to my answer regarding your proposal of marriage. The tension in the air between them was almost palpable as James Mays waited for her response, his remarkable eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity that spoke of hopes and fears held in careful balance. Sarah felt the weight of the moment, the knowledge that her next words would determine the entire course of both their futures. My answer is yes, she said quietly, watching as the words struck him with almost physical force. I accept your proposal, James Mays, and I pray that we may find in marriage the partnership and happiness that we have both been seeking. For a moment, James simply stared at her as if unable to believe what he had heard. Then, with a movement that seemed almost involuntary, he swept her into his arms and held her against his chest with a fervor that spoke of overwhelming relief and joy. Sarah felt herself melting into his embrace, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the depth of feelings that had been growing in her heart throughout their brief but intense acquaintance. Sarah, he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. You have made me the happiest man in Dakota Territory. I swear to you that you will never regret this decision, that I will spend my life proving worthy of the trust you have placed in me. And I swear to be the partner you described, Sarah replied, drawing back slightly to look into his eyes. To contribute my own strength and capabilities to building something lasting together, rather than simply benefiting from your achievements. We will build an empire together, James said with quiet conviction, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. Not just of land and cattle, but of love and mutual respect that will stand as an example to the entire territory. They might have remained lost in their embrace indefinitely, but the sound of voices outside reminded them that they were not alone. James reluctantly released her, though he kept one of her hands firmly clasped in his as they moved to the window to observe his waiting men. How quickly can you be ready to depart? He asked, his tone becoming practical despite the obvious difficulty of shifting from romantic to mundane concerns. I had hoped we might be married in Deadwood this very afternoon, if you are willing to proceed with such haste. I am ready now, Sarah replied, surprising herself with the decisiveness of her response. I have already packed my few belongings and made what arrangements I could for the cabin. There is nothing keeping me here except memories, and those I can carry in my heart. James Mays's expression grew tender at her words, and she could see that he understood the magnitude of what she was leaving behind. Are you certain you can bear to abandon the home you shared with Thomas? I would not want you to feel that I am forcing you to sacrifice your connection to his memory. Thomas would want me to choose life over mourning, Sarah replied with quiet certainty. He would approve of my decision to find happiness again rather than waste away in lonely dedication to the past. The cabin will remain, and others may find shelter here as I found peace. That seems a fitting continuation of what we built together. Then let us begin our new life without delay, James said, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture that sent tremors of anticipation through her frame. I confess I am eager to make you my wife-in-law, as well as in heart. The journey to Deadwood passed in a blur of snow-covered prairie and excited conversation as James shared his plans for their future together. He spoke of the ranch house that would become her domain, of the business partnerships and social obligations that would shape their life together, of his hopes for the children they might raise in the vast expanse of Dakota Territory. Sarah found herself caught up in his enthusiasm, her natural intelligence already beginning to grasp the complexities of the life she was entering. The wedding ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, conducted by Judge Harrison in his office above the general store with James's foreman and the local banker serving as witnesses. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple blue wool that had served for church and special occasions during her marriage to Thomas, while James had somehow managed to procure a ring of remarkable beauty despite the short notice. As they exchanged vows in the practical setting of the judge's office, Sarah felt the profound significance of the moment. She was not merely changing her name and circumstances, but embarking upon an entirely new existence that would test every capability she possessed while offering opportunities she had never dared imagine. Do you, Sarah McKenzie, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? Judge Harrison intoned with ceremonial gravity. I do, Sarah replied clearly, her voice steady despite the momentous nature of her commitment. And do you, James Mays, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, James answered with fervent conviction, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Then by the authority vested in me by Dakota Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Mays. The kiss that followed was gentle but filled with promise, a sealing of their covenant that sent warmth spreading through Sarah's entire being. When they finally separated, she found herself looking into the eyes of her husband with a mixture of love and anticipation that made her feel as if her life was truly beginning anew. The return journey to the Double Eagle Ranch took most of the remaining daylight, but Sarah scarcely noticed the passage of time as she rode beside James in the comfortable traveling carriage he had somehow procured for the occasion. They talked of everything and nothing, sharing the intimate conversation of newlyweds while the vast prairie rolled past outside their windows. As they crested the final rise before the ranch headquarters, Sarah gasped at her first sight of what was now her home. The main house was a sprawling structure of native stone and imported timber, clearly designed to reflect both the rugged beauty of the territory and the refined taste of its owner. Outbuildings spread across the valley floor in ordered profusion, speaking of an enterprise of remarkable scope and efficiency. Welcome home, Mrs. Mays, James said softly, and Sarah felt her heart swell with the realization that she was indeed home in a way she had never expected to experience again. The household staff that awaited their arrival was both numerous and clearly devoted to their employer, greeting Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and respect that suggested James had chosen his people well. Mrs. Patterson, the foreman's wife who served as housekeeper, proved to be a motherly woman whose warm welcome went far toward easing Sarah's nervousness about assuming her new role. As evening fell and they found themselves alone in the elegant sitting room that adjoined the master bedroom, Sarah felt the full weight of the transformation that had occurred in her life. A week ago, she had been a struggling widow facing an uncertain future. Tonight, she was the wife of one of the territory's most prominent citizens, mistress of a grand household, and partner in an enterprise that spanned thousands of acres. Are you overwhelmed by the magnitude of the changes in your circumstances? James asked gently, seeming to sense her internal struggle to comprehend her new reality. Somewhat, Sarah admitted honestly. Yet I find myself more excited than frightened by the challenges ahead. You have given me not just security and position, but the opportunity to become more than I ever imagined possible. And you have given me something I had despaired of ever finding, James replied, moving to take her in his arms once more. A true partner who sees me as a man rather than merely a collection of assets, who chose me for what we might build together rather than for what I could provide. As they stood together in the lamplight of their new home, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A simple act of kindness toward a freezing stranger had transformed her life completely, opening doors to possibilities she had never dared contemplate. Yet, even more precious than the material benefits was the growing certainty that she had found in James Mays not just a husband but a true companion of the heart. The future stretched before them filled with challenges and opportunities, social obligations and business ventures, the prospect of children, and the promise of building something lasting in the wild beauty of Dakota Territory. Whatever obstacles they might face, Sarah felt confident that together they could overcome them, that their partnership would prove stronger than the sum of its individual parts. As James drew her closer and she felt the warmth of his embrace surrounding her, Sarah offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the blizzard that had brought them together and the courage that had enabled them both to recognize the possibilities that love could create. She had rescued a freezing stranger from the storm, never dreaming that in saving his life she would find the salvation of her own heart. Now, as Mrs. James Mays, she looked forward to discovering just how magnificent their shared future might become.